Hello, this is Orthotomeo, and I am S.W. Kibler. Orthotomeo is rightly dividing, rightly handling the Word of God. This is straight talk about the biblical text. We have an interesting lesson for today, and I hope that it will both challenge you and help you solidify in your own mind the truth of the biblical text. So let's get started. We're going to start back in Genesis chapter 1. We'll read through the verses that we've already looked at, and then we're going to move on to several more. So Genesis chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, uninhabited. And darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Now, we're going to read out of the New Testament. It holds something that's really important for us to look at, but it confirms what Genesis is saying. This is talking specifically about the one we know as Yeshua, Jesus the Christ, right? And it says, Colossians 1, chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, "For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So there are things that God created that are invisible to our eyes. And they exist. Some possibly, we've talked about this, in other dimensions, but some have an effect on our dimension, and they're still not viewable. They're invisible. These invisible things, right, are still invisible even though light has been created. And that's important. This theme of light will play an important part in various parts of the biblical text, all the way through the New Testament. For instance, we're going to read now, and this is John 1, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 4 through 5. It says, "In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." So that's pretty substantial. And then we have the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 12. "Again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." So we see that even though light shines, there are still things that are invisible. Yeshua, Jesus the Christ, is a perfect example of that. Is that although he was the light of the world and he was the light of life, still there were those who walked in darkness. And even though the light was there, they could not see Yeshua for who he was. To them, in his reality, it was as though he was invisible. They could not comprehend him. So now we're going to go back to Genesis. And this is from Answers in Genesis. This is on their site. And if you're not familiar with Answers in Genesis, I suggest you become very familiar with them, because they're very astute and a very good source when it comes to Genesis and creation science. So what we find is we've looked at day 1 for now, and we're going to be moving to day 2. And remember that we have days 1 through 6 that we're going to need to move through. So that's just kind of where we are, right? So we're going to look at a piece of the text here. And I'm sorry, I'm going to keep putting on my glasses just so I can see everything here. And I'm going to be reading out of Genesis 1, 6 through 8. I hope you can see that. Yep, it looks visible to me. So that's good. So we're going to look now in the text at one of these invisible parts of God's creative acts. Right? It's invisible, but it's part of it. It's something that God created on day 2 of creation. Day 2 of creation. Okay? And here we go. So it's Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day." So before we go any further, I want to ask you a simple question. And that is, what do you think of when you hear the word sky? Such as, I went out and looked up into the sky. What comes into your mind when you hear the word sky? Okay, so I'm going to rephrase the sentence and say it this way. I went out and looked into the sky at noon. Now what comes into your mind? Okay, let me rephrase the sentence again. I went out and looked into the sky at midnight. I went out and looked into the sky at midnight. Now what comes into your mind? Do you think differently when sky is used at noon compared to when sky is used at midnight? Probably your view changed when day and night changed. The reality is the word means the same regardless of when you go and look up. Now, dictionary.com defines sky as the region of clouds or upper air, the upper atmosphere of the earth. Number 2, the heavens or firmament appearing as a great arch or vault. So in some of your versions that you're going to be reading this text, it'll use the word expanse or it'll use the word firmament. And it's the same Hebrew word. It's just the translators, when they were writing, when they were putting into English the different versions, they chose different words to explain what the Hebrew was. But the expanse or firmament is really the same. So the heavens or firmament appearing as a great arch or vault. And number 3 is the supernal or celestial heaven. Supernal or celestial heaven. Okay? Now that's pretty straightforward. I think we can grasp those 3. The region of the clouds in the upper air, the upper atmosphere of earth, the heavens or the firmament, or the supernal or the celestial heaven. I think we can, that's pretty straightforward. So there's a biblical version that I like to use at times because I think it's usually pretty accurate, and it's called the Hebrew Names version. And I like the way that it translates here. And so I'm going to read from the Hebrew Names version. I'm going to read again Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." God made the expanse and divided the waters which were under the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse sky. There was evening and there was morning a second day. Now, the Hebrew word translated as expanse is rakia, rakia. And it's used here improperly. It means an expanse, the firmament, or that visible arch of the sky. It doesn't matter when you look at it, whether in the daylight, when all you can see is the sun, maybe some birds flying in the sky, an occasional airplane making its way to some destination, or some puffy, fluffy clouds just lazily floating. Or you look at it in the night and you can see the moon, the stars, the planets. They all are in the expanse. They are in the firmament. The expanse does not include what is in the expanse. That is, the expanse does not include the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, the clouds, the birds. Here's why. If we move just a little bit forward, and I know we're jumping ahead, and we're going to move to verse 14, but it's important as we look at the expanse. So this is Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 16. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give lights upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. So, the biblical text is very specific. The planets and the stars were placed in the expanse by the Creator God after Creator God had made the expanse. Right? He made the expanse. The expanse is part of a creative act of God, and it includes more than just the atmosphere around this planet. It includes the places where he later will hang the sun, the planets, the stars, and the galaxies. We tend to have this idea that there is nothing between the planets and the stars, and there is nothing between the various solar systems or the galaxies. But that is not the case. There is something there, and it has properties. It can be detected, but it is invisible. It's real. It exists, and it has its own unique properties, but it's invisible. Now we're going to look at that piece next video. So now we're just going to move on. So looking at the expanse and knowing that the earth, now this would be after dry ground appears, correct? Right? But this is the expanse. You can see has no stars, no planets, no nothing. You'll also notice in this picture that the planet Earth is the Pangea, right? It's the Pangean landmass. And that is because originally there were not the separate continents that we have on Earth today. There was one central landmass. And then later, at the time of Noah's flood, that's recorded in Genesis chapter 6 and beyond, that the continents separated away into where they are as we experience them today. But originally, there was one land mass, and it was called Pangea. So, and there's other information too, that although scientists agree that there was what they call, is often termed simplistically as the continental drift, that over long period of times the continents separated and ended up where they are today. There's evidence that shows that it was not a continental drift, but it was a continental sprint, and that it happened rather quickly and over the time of the flood and very soon after the flood. So the next one, so here's the expanse, and then there's the sun and the stars and the planets that were hung in the expanse at a later time, specifically in day 4. So I thought that was interesting to show the difference that we see. There was not other planets, and this little dot you see right here is really just a reflection of a light from my ceiling. It's really not on the picture. It's just all black around there. And then God, on day 4, made the stars and the planets and the sun and the moon and everything else that he hung in what he had created on the second day, which was the expanse. Right? So let's move on to one last, and what I think is an interesting and important item, and that is in day 2 of creation in the biblical text. Why didn't God say it was good? Now, he said it was good on day 1 of creation, and he said it was good on day 3 of creation, and he said it was good on day 4 of creation, he said it was good on day 5 of creation, and he said it was good on day 6 of creation. On day 7, he didn't create, he rested. But of the 5 of the 6 days of creation, God said it was good. But on day 2, it's not in the biblical text. Why would that be? Well, there are 2 really prominent positions or thoughts on that. And then I'm going to give you a third, which I was thinking about as my own thoughts. But the first thought about why God didn't say good is that he didn't do anything. Right? All he did was separate the waters. And say that the firmament or the expanse, it really wasn't created on day 2. And that since it wasn't active creation, he just took material that was already created on day 1 and he separated it. But that's not what the biblical text says. And then we have the second one, and that is that God actively created on day 2, but it wasn't earth-centric. It didn't focus on the earth. And so he didn't call it good. Right? So it's because the primary focus was in the heavens or out off the earth and not on the earth. And so he just didn't call it good. So the first proposition is that God didn't call the second day good because he really didn't create, but that's not what the biblical text says, right? It says he made the expanse. So there was creation on day 2. The second proposition is that because what was done was not earth focused, it was focused off the earth, that He created some things, subatomic particle, gravitational forces, natural laws, and so forth, but that it didn't really apply to the earth, and so he didn't mention that it was good. What I think is possible, and this is the third proposition, and that's my position at this point, is that the creation of the expanse was preliminary to what was to follow. Okay. So in one case, it was preliminary, so there was something to hang the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets in. Okay. Because remember, the expanse has properties. It's detectable, but it's not seeable. And the planets don't hang in nothing. The planets hang in something. And number two is that the waters that were separated, okay, that the waters above the expanse may have been reserved for the judgment at the time of Noah. God, in his omniscience, knew what was going to happen, and he prepared the judgment beforehand at the beginning. While part of the creation of the expanse was good, that part where the planets are hung, right, the expanse, was good. But the water separated above was reserved for the expected and known judgment that was going to take place. So he couldn't call it all good because he knew that sin was going to enter the world and that he was going to have to execute judgment. And he reserved those waters. Now, I'll admit, number three is my own ponderings. I didn't read this from anybody that I can recall. It's not in the 15 or plus resources that I've been reading, looking at the creation. But it's something that I look at and say, well, this makes sense. God separated this for a reason. And I've looked at around 15 plus different resources, and I found that few agree with each other. There's a lot of interpretation and speculation on the days of creation, especially on the expanse and the sky and so forth. But what I've presented is what I feel is the most plausible and most in keeping with the biblical text itself, without having to shove anything into the biblical text. Just taking the biblical text for what it is and what it says. Now, there are some things that the biblical text, as we've seen, is very specific about, but is put in terms that a human can understand. So it's not as complicated as it was, the creation process, but it's understandable. Right? And I believe that the biblical text is presented in a way that the human mind can understand it. And I also believe that it was given in the perfect way, right? The exact way, and it is truth. And I hope to show you that when you look at the biblical text, that true scientific evidence is compatible with the biblical text without having to accommodate scientific evidence. Right? Because we look at the scientific evidence and we interpret the evidence of science by the truth of the scripture. And what we find is they are compatible. Well, I hope this has been interesting for you. I love it. I am just always so thrilled to be able to present this biblical teaching to you, the straight talk about the biblical text. This is Orthotomeo. I am S.W. Kibler, and I want to remind you to know the truth, stand on the truth, and speak the truth. And God bless you.